Welcome to the Midwestern Marks Ghosts of Plum Run Hour. I'm Tim Russo, author of the Star Wars series for leftists, Ghosts of Plum Run. Thank you for joining us for the audiobook of Volume 2, Serpents and Dust. Today we read Chapter 2, where in the dreamed-of Netflix series, fellow Clevelander MGK plays the kid who punches his dad in the face. So, MGK, if you're a Midwestern Marxist, have your people call my people, and we'll get going. Last week, we asked, why are we here? The answer is, of course, capitalism, because it always is. And today we have a story of Gramscian cultural hegemony. Slavery is a function of capital. Capital will seek the lowest cost until it is stopped. So, no-cost labor pre-Civil War filtered through every inch of the world economy and enforced itself through the acquiescence of the masses. If it is threatened in this pursuit, capital will go on the attack, as the Confederacy did in the American Civil War, even in families, which is our story today. As Marx said, there was no such country as the South, except as a battle slogan for capital. Before the Civil War, no state in the Union was more dependent on slave labor adding zero cost to cotton than Rhode Island, which is where Rasselas Maury was born and raised, before traveling to Minnesota sometime between appearing on the 1860 census at home in Rhode Island and mustering into the 1st Minnesota in St. Paul on May 25th, 1861. From its slave port in Newport, where all the mansions are today, to the cotton mills literally surrounding Maury's childhood, Maury's Rhode Island tells the story of capital's hold through slavery on society at large. Maury's childhood experience with the cultural hegemony of capital is more detailed in Volume 1, which is available on Amazon. But for today's Volume 2, Chapter 2, we do know that a widow Tucker did live next door to the house where Maury grew up, likely on the Maury family's land. And we do know that the Maury family was indeed tied into the Rhode Island cotton economy through the local bank. So let's get to Chapter 2, Volume 2, Serpents and Dust. The chapter is called Button. On May 25th, 1861, Rasselas Maury mustered into Company A of the 1st Minnesota in St. Paul as a private at age 20. 1 year earlier, a serpent, which had silently coiled around his entire life, finally unsheathed its fangs, leaving Rasselas a sad, lonely boy becoming a man in a tent near Smithfield, Rhode Island, questioning everything about his world. "Your father was just trying to protect you," Mama desperately insisted as her son entered the kitchen, bewildered and lost. Rasselas looked at his mother, a tear in her eye, a soul of torment within himself. He could barely summon words, so he whispered them. "Protect me from what? A witch?" Rasselas said. "Where is he?" Mama asked. Rasselas looked at the teeth scratches on his knuckles. "On Widow Tucker's living room floor," Rasselas answered. With one punch, Rasselas Maury ended his relationship with his father that summer of 1860. Ziba Maury Jr. bled from his face on the floor of the late Widow Tucker's empty house next door on the Maury homestead. Years before Rasselas was born, the sainted Maury elders granted an act of mercy to a woman in need who'd lost a husband to murder and reprisal for her involvement in the Pawtucket textile strike of 1824, then lost his daughter in childbirth. The Maury family donated the house next door to Widow Tucker for 30 years of charity exile until her 1860 death. By the time Rasselas was born, the town of Smithfield had cast Widow Tucker into a witchy exile, the price for letting her live with a roof over her head. Cotton mills ruled nearly every corner of Rhode Island, half a dozen around Smithfield alone. Anyone daring to even imagine questions about King Cotton learned the lesson of Widow Tucker one way or another. As a boy, Rasselas helped spread the witchy rumors of the old maid next door. At age 8, a kid romping through autumn leaves across Widow Tucker's front yard, Rasselas fell into a pile of dung One darkening, spooky night, flies swarming up from the ground to cover him, hiding from 3 ladies mysteriously walking by to enter the witchy house. As boys do, he of course imagined the 3 ladies were witches too, entering the house that night. How easily a witchy exile extended, Rosellas remembered, and how delightfully all the kids entertained themselves over spells of flies for days. King Cotton taught its lessons well in Rhode Island, generation to generation. A boy was never so proud of himself as the day Rosellas apologized to Widow Tucker a few weeks later for thinking her a witch. 8-year-old Rosellas gave Widow Tucker joy by simply returning. Just a short visit from the boy next door is all it took. A hello, a little kid sorrowful for his meanness, for spreading rumors, for helping keep Widow Tucker in exile. After he apologized, Rosellas immediately sank back into the swarm that created her exile, never returning. Slowly, imperceptibly, countless invisibly sharp pins and needles pushed Rosellas this way then that, until he decided it was not such a good idea to go back to Widow Tucker's. No one wanted him to. Mama stopped sending little Rosellas over to deliver the annual Christmas pie next door. He grew up to a teenager, forgetting it all, forgot Widow Tucker, forgot there might be someone next door waiting for him. She died alone that summer of 1860, having waited those 11 years for little Rosellas to come back one day, so she could tell him why she was an exile who everyone thought was a witch. But the boy never returned. Now 19, Rosellas unclenched his fist, amazed at what a fool a little boy can be, fool enough to conjure witches. How easy it was for a town, his world, to train him to believe that the woman next door had cast a spell of flies on him. The knuckles on his right hand now scraped with his father's teeth marks, Rosellas finally learned King Cotton's lesson of Widow Tucker. From the kitchen window, watching her son approach the house, his head down, his walk slow, Mama knew right away. When Widow Tucker died that summer of 1860, she knew her husband would tear through and empty that house indiscriminately without a care in the world for anything Widow Tucker left behind. To cleanse of her, erase the woman, her life, her lessons, her tragedy, and whatever she might mean to their son. So Mama hurried to send Rosellas next door to clean up Widow Tucker's empty house before his father got there. Mama knew Rosellas would want a moment there alone. His father made that moment very brief. His mother watching his every move, Rosellas went to his room, packed a haversack of clothes, things to camp with, then walked to the barn, grabbed the tent pole, a canvas for it, and just hiked to the back of the family orchard to a favorite spot in the backwoods. Those woods were paradise for generations of Maori children where stories of witches could be brewed. As kids, the Maori boys created endless adventure there, far enough away from anyone's house that no noise would be heard. All manner of ruckus could carry on. Forts built from fallen timbers, sword fights with sticks, tree houses, secret societies, the usual boy stuff. No one even knew whose land it might be, just some woods. There, that summer afternoon, Rosellas built himself his final childhood hideaway, intending to never go back home. Rosellas' father returned from Widow Tucker's house to find his wife Everlene's eyes swelled red with crying, standing in the kitchen. Prowling in like a hyena who just slaughtered some prey, slowly, determined, Zeba Maori Jr. declared, "It was for his own good." She saw his lip bleeding. "And now he despises you," Mama shot back, reaching for a towel to apply some first aid. That woman would have filled his head with ideas. "Like what?" Mama shouted. "Spells? You should never have sent him over there with Christmas pies all those years." "It was your family that put her in that house," Mama insisted. "My father made many mistakes in his life," Zeba replied. Mama dabbed at his split lip with the towel. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Zeba Maori Jr. "Don't you talk to your husband like that," Zeba warned. "I will speak as I see fit," Mama warned right back, pressing on the wound to cause a shot of pain straight up her husband's jaw. "That boy worshipped the ground you walked on, and now you've thrown it all away." She pressed at the cut harder. "Spent a good long time doing it, too." Zeba stewed. She was planning to tell him about Pawtucket. The whole house is filled with her things from Pawtucket. Mama paused the first aid and stepped back from her husband, stunned. So she waited for him to come back with a Christmas pie all these years. She was going to fill his head with ideas, Ziba said. Mama's heart sank deeper to places she never thought it could. She waited a decade for Rosellas to visit, and then she died, and that's why your son punched you in the face, isn't it? Ziba grabbed the towel from his wife to apply his own first aid to his lip, so self-assured in his moral righteousness, he didn't even notice his wife's shock. I will not have a son with a head full of those ideas, Ziba said. Mama marched out, heading straight for Widow Tucker's house to see what sort of ideas the dead woman had planned to fill her son with. Don't you go in there, Ziba shouted at her, following behind the most determined woman he'd ever seen in his life, chasing her up the porch stairs. At the front door, Ziba grabbed her arm, but she spun to yank it away, glaring at her husband. I will clean this up for you, Mama shouted, and marched in. There, strewn about, was Widow Tucker's box of memories from the Pawtucket textile strike of 1824. The hush of a museum enveloped her, and Mama stared. Ziba stood on the porch, turning away from his wife for a moment, then looked in. He saw his wife pick up the banner spun from Negro cloth that read, quote, Down with the Lords of Lash and Loom. She held it, touched it, reading the words scrawled in black paint. As Mama began to fold the banner carefully, Ziba's rage returned, and he ran into the house to grab the banner just as he had done right before Rosellas punched him silly. Mama heard him coming, turning to fold the banner ever more lovingly, demonstratively, so her husband could see precisely the care she would take to pack up Widow Tucker's things. Is this what bothered you? Mama asked directly, folding. Ziba halted in his tracks. Is this what caused you to end your relationship with your own son? Ziba burned inside as his wife exposed his own darkness before him. Is this why you let our boy think that woman was a witch? She continued to fold the banner. That she cast a spell of flies upon him, that she should not be given a pie at Christmas? Ziba was silenced. Answer me, demanded Mama from her slowly shrinking husband. Answer me, Ziba Mowry Jr. So he did. This town, this entire state, is filled with cotton mills, Ziba replied finally. Our family has money in cotton mills. My cousin is on the board of the Smithfield Bank, which invests in cotton mills, handles the money of cotton mills. I do not want my son to rot disowned by this town, too. Well done, your son has disowned you, Mama said with such calmness it horrified her husband. She finished folding the banner tenderly, placing it down on a table, then continued to gather up the memories of Widow Tucker to put back into the box. I listened to you about this matter our whole marriage, Mama said, continuing to gather the memories as Ziba stood speechless, his wife seizing power over him against his will, stunned by it. I followed your rules for our tenant. I never invited Mrs. Tucker over. I never came to visit her. I knew she mourned a husband killed by cotton mill owners 36 years ago. I knew she lost that husband's child when it was born. Then she saw it. She picked it up. A tiny little stuffed bear sewn together by Widow Tucker in 1824 for the baby she lost made Mama's calmness crack. She read the note pinned to it meant for Rosellas 11 years ago, learning the baby was a girl. Widow Tucker planned to tell her son about the daughter she lost 11 years ago. Mama's breath grew heavy. She looked up at the ceiling to God to calm her, wishing her son had done so before hurling his fist at his father. Then, trembling, she looked down at the floor, then at her husband, who was now so ashamed he stared at a wall blankly. It was a girl, Mama whispered, holding the bear. Having lost 2 girls in their childhoods, Mama's stone-cold demeanor was no match. So she wailed out her pain and Widow Tucker's. My God, it was a girl! Mama exclaimed to the sky. Ziba rushed to comfort his wife. She caught herself, snapping instantly from grief to determination again at her husband, her swollen eyes knifing deep into his before he could embrace her. Promise me you'll apologize to Rosellas, Mama demanded of her husband, or I swear to the Lord God Almighty your son will hate you for the rest of his life. After a few days, Mama started visiting Rosellas in his tent every morning to bring food and supplies. School was over. Rosellas had nothing in life before him except a boundless, unknown future. Mama decided this time in a tent alone was good for her boy, no matter how it began. She knew he wasn't coming back to the house, if ever. The sudden emptiness in a mother's heart at the loss of her child to manhood pained her. more because of how it happened that day in Widow Tucker's front room. But he was close enough to visit, so she did, and she was still his mother, and mother him she would. Mama knew Rosellis wouldn't want to talk, so she made sure to come by the tent early enough that he'd still be asleep, leaving a basket behind just after sunrise with some laundry, fresh milk, eggs, a loaf of bread, or a peach pie, and a little note ending with, "I love you," every time. She'd peer into the tent to see her boy asleep. Only his snoring reminded her Rosellis wasn't a boy anymore. Each night, Rosellis left that morning's basket at the flap of the tent for Mama to replace the next day, a little note inside ending with, "I love you too, Mother." Life at the tent suited Rosellis just fine. His brothers ignored him entirely, seeing him only when he helped to harvest the peaches, as always. He'd return to the house when he knew his father wouldn't be there, for a bath, to fill a jug of water, or to pick up a favorite book of maps. The tent became filled with maps over the summer. Mama brought another book with each morning delivery. Soon the tent was a home, its walls thickened by books, a small writing table, an oil lamp. Sometimes Rosellis took a fishing pole to one of the creeks nearby, but the water reminded him of the cotton mills it flowed through, so he didn't fish very often. If he caught a fish, he would feel guilt frying it in a pan over his campfire. Getting to sleep was difficult. He would lie on the floor of his tent, studying the canvas above him, wondering where its threads were spun, by how many slaves. Every stitch of cloth around him began to leap from itself to tell Rosellis a story about Widow Tucker in Pawtucket's textile mills. His sleep was fitful, always, a nightmare pushing him awake almost every night. Something awful but unidentifiable, a weighted dread of some sort. So Rosellis grabbed a jug of his father's whiskey on one of his earliest trips back to the house just to be able to sleep. A pattern set in. Every night, he'd whiskey himself to sleep. The next morning, he'd study maps, hike the woods. Then, as the heat of the summer day peaked, he would doze off his hangover for a few hours until 3 or 4 p.m. His evenings were spent in the tent, flap closed to keep the bugs out, studying maps by the oil lamp, leaning on the whiskey to put him to bed. The days lengthened until solstice, then began to shorten a minute or so each day, and Rosellis set his schedule by it, navigating life that summer by the stars, the sun, the rotation of the earth itself. After about a month, a visitor interrupted the routine. A cat wandered into the tent as Rosellis stirred from his afternoon nap. He looked up from his pillow, and there at the flap of his tent was the most beautiful, big, puffy, black and white furry thing Rosellis had ever seen, just peering in curiously. He rubbed his eyes, sat up, and the cat just marched into his lap to purr, coo, and cuddle. Rosellis squeezed and hugged his new friend, who only wanted more, and Rosellis felt his approaching manhood melt back to a boy. Out it all came. "I'm so sorry," Rosellis cried over and over and over to the cat, bobbing back and forth, holding the cat inconsolably, who seemed to know its soft presence was needed, so just curled up with Rosellis to soak it all in. Just as quickly, the cat up and left, racing out the tent. The next day, Rosellis left a plate of milk at the tent flap before his nap, and the cat returned for it, curling up with him to wake him from his nap, its belly filled with warm milk. They were fast friends. A week of daily kitty therapy passed when Rosellis noticed the cat not leave one day, but wait at the tent flap, looking out at someone. We're going to take a quick break here to talk a little bit about how I found Rosellis. So this is the annotation for today's episode. The seminal book of The Charge of the First Minnesota is this one, Pale Horse at Plum Run by Brian Lehan. If you're looking for a detailed, the most detailed account of the charge, it's Brian Lehan's book, Pale Horse at Plum Run. And in Brian's book, he published this photograph, which is a photograph of the veterans of Company A in Plum Run. And in the back, in the very back of that photograph, is Rosellis Maury in 1897 at the dedication of the monument to the First Minnesota's charge. And on the next page, you will see also at at the reunion underneath the monument, third from the right there is Marcellus Maury. Again in 1897 at the dedication. So, when I started looking into Marcellus Maury, I looked into all the men in that picture to decide who would be in this story, and Maury jumped out because of his. He looked like he didn't want to be at Gettysburg for the reunion in 1897 in those pictures. And that, of course, drew me to him. And it turns out he is this sort of fellow who kind of is lost. He seems a bit lost in his life decisions because there's a year where he's in Rhode Island at the beginning of the year, and then suddenly he's mustering into the 1st Minnesota a year later. So that drew me to Marcellus Maury's story, and he seemed like the sort of fellow who would punch his dad in the face over something like that, and that's why we have this little nugget about Mr. Maury. So let's get back to Marcellus in his tent at the back of the Maury homestead in Rhode Island the year before he musters in to the 1st Minnesota. "Button," a girl called. Marcellus watched from his nap spot as the cat didn't want to leave the tent. "Button, where are you?" Marcellus joined Button at the tent flap to look out and see a girl approaching through the trees. "I think I have your cat," Marcellus called from inside the tent. The girl looked around for where the voice came from. "Over here," Marcellus waved. "Oh, dear," the girl announced as she marched for the tent. "I do beg your pardon." No, he's just fine," Marcellus declared, crawling out of the tent, picking up Button to cuddle one last time before handing him over. He walked to the girl with Button in his arms. "His name's Button?" "Yes, and he's nothing but trouble," the girl said, taking her kitty. "I'm afraid I've attached him to a plate of warm milk every afternoon," Marcellus admitted. The girl cocked her head like a scolding mother. "You look familiar. I'm Alice. I think you were a few grades behind me at school. You're Marcellus Maury, aren't you?" "I know I shouldn't have." "Oh, this cat," Alice tisk. "Now he's going to want milk all day." "You're a bit taller than I remember." And with that, their courtship began. They didn't know it, but that bone-chilling autumn day 11 years ago, Marcellus and Alice had crossed paths on Widow Tucker's front yard. Alice was one of the 3 witches little Marcellus saw enter Widow Tucker's house, dragged along by her mother to one of those meetings Alice had grown to hate. Alice's childhood was forever punctuated by hush-hush clandestine gatherings, readings, lectures. Always some stranger had to be accommodated, met, confided with, or visited. By the day 11 years ago she walked by little Marcellus hiding in a pile of leaves under a spell of flies, Alice had had enough, merely going through the motions to please her mother. To Alice, her Widow Tucker visit was just one in a blizzard of irritants endured as her mother tried unsuccessfully to pass her own life down to Alice, completely forgotten before it was over. It was all so tiresome. Alice's mother learned of Widow Tucker through the next of Rhode Island's brief experiences with rebellion, by which Alice's mother was stirred to action just as Widow Tucker had been in Pawtucket. In 1841, 17 years after the Pawtucket's textile strike, a man named Thomas Wilson Dorr dared to challenge that voting in Rhode Island was limited to white male property owners, had himself elected governor alongside an already existing governor, ended up in jail with one poor fellow killed by a cannon which misfired and exploded. The end result of this Dorr rebellion manifested a few years later when Rhode Island extended suffrage a bit, but not to Alice's mother, nor immigrants, nor anyone who couldn't afford to pay the $1 poll tax. And, as in Pawtucket, an entire movement was left behind, each person scattered to the 4 winds, each alone, soon to be ostracized to their own little personal corner of oblivion. As such things do, Alice's mother's experience with rebellion exile connected her to Widow Tucker somehow. A signal seemed to light in the sky, connecting all the radicals in Rhode Island to share their experiences over tea and cakes, knitting, and reminiscence. Just a toddler, Alice met this world as her mother's display prop at every such gatherings. Learn the songs, Alice. Dance the jigs, Alice. Read the books, Alice. By age 14, when Alice's mother was the only person in town who dared to go to Widow Tucker's house, Alice had disengaged entirely. She was completely oblivious that night. She walked right by the boy she'd fallen in love with in the woods 11 years later, who gave her cat milk on hot days from his own exile tent. Village, Rhode Island being as cloistered as it was in 1860, Rosellas and Alice couldn't help crossing paths. Alice grew up in Greenville, the fork of roads in town just a mile or two south of the Mowry homestead. Rosellas walked to school in Greenville every day. Alice's father worked as a barkeep and clerk at the Waterman Tavern in Greenville, named after yet another of Rhode Island's ever-so-pious founding families. Patriarch Richard Waterman arrived from England in 1629 at Salem, Massachusetts, and was promptly exiled for one heresy or another into the wilderness of Rhode Island. There, Richard bore generations of Waterman heirs named Resolved. So resolute they were. The third Waterman heir, named Resolved, Richard's great-grandson, established the tavern in Greenville in 1733. In 1822, a bank was created and headquartered at Waterman Tavern, called the Smithfield Exchange Bank. One of Rosellas' great-uncles was a founding board member, the board seat being passed from Mowry to Mowry until Rosellas' father cowered from its power over him such that he let his son conjure a witch next door. Being a barkeep in a tavern where he also clerked at the bank headquartered there gave Alice's father the best possible front row seat for just about every morsel of town gossip imaginable. Between her father's unique access and her mother's unique isolation, Allison grew up in a maze of confusion as strange as Rosellas did. They never became friends at school in Greenville. Being too little for the older kids to bother with, Rosellas never even knew Alice, but Alice remembered little Russell as that bookish boy whose father helped build the stone walls around Smithfield and who somehow was related to the bank board Mowry. She heard the tale spread, of course, but never knew Rosellas had sparked the spell of flies stories about Widow Tucker. Alice paid no mind to such witchy stories anyway, because she'd heard them about her own mother, who at various points in time had also been thought a witch of some sort. The whole nonsense Alice merely banished to the back of her mind. Just pointless town blather. Thus, it never occurred to Alice what Rosellas was going through, why Rosellas became instantly attached to her cat, Button, why Rosellas was in a tent, alone in a patch of woods. "I thought you lived in Greenville," Rosellas asked. "Oh, I'm visiting my aunt for the summer," Alice explained, petting her cat. "She lives on the other side of these woods." Button likes these woods a bit too much. "That's my fault," Rosellas smiled, petting Button in Alice's arms. Alice noticed Rosellas become emotional over her cat. "You really like him, don't you?" "I guess." Rosellas felt his self-isolation crack a bit, so immediately filled the crack. "Would you like some whiskey?" "My goodness," Alice laughed. "How did you know I worked at the Waterman Tavern?" "I didn't. Do you?" "My father's footsteps must be followed," Alice joked, launching into the explanation of her father's peculiar place in Greenville's oldest tavern and bank. Rosellas only half listened, distracted by Alice's beauty, her soft porcelain arms enveloping his new favorite cat. "Are you related to the Mowry on the board of the bank?" "I suppose," Rosellas said, kicking at the dirt, turning to his tent. Alice followed with Button. "May I see your tent?" Alice asked. It was a short courtship from the tent flap to Rosellas's arms that night. No talking, not very much anyway. The 1860 presidential election was in full swing that summer, and no one wanted to talk much about anything, lest they be, by some mistake, misunderstanding, or sheer chance, forced through a hail of political bullets in their own family over the festering sores America leaves behind for young lovers to navigate, just to be young. Not so much a fog. The 1860 presidential election functioned as a set of tripwired shocks in the air, waiting to potentially electrocute your every breath. Utterances of all kinds entered the 1860 presidential campaign ooze to be examined under a microscope instantly for various potential heresies to excommunicate. No word uttered was ever immune. Escape from this into someone's arms in a hideaway tent in the woods with a little whiskey around and her cat came naturally to Alice. Rosellas didn't mind one bit. Neither knew the other had figured out the world their elders left them to survive in was a towering, gargantuan fraud, but both felt it. Night came. "Will we wed?" Alice asked coyly before sunrise, starlight peeking through the tent flap. Aging, tiresome, puritanical rules of courtship were shattered that night for two souls weary of rules of all kinds. "I suppose we must," Rosellas declared. And so it went. A summer of blissful delight each day, their world apart from the one around them. A month went by. Alice would let Button visit first every afternoon for tradition's sake, like a game. Button sipped some milk Rosellas left for him. Alice would call for Button, like the first time they met, and Rosellas would join Button at the tent flap to say hello. A lazy afternoon of looking at Rosellas's maps, and they'd watch the sunset. Rosellas would build a campfire, cook something up, moonlight, then Alice would go back to her aunt's house before sunrise. Rosellas took to camp cooking, his mother still making daily deliveries safely after Alice had left in the morning. Thunderstorms were the most excitement for either of them, something about darkening skies opening with explosive energy to soak them underneath, soothed them both. The world had gone mad, and the skies knew it occasionally. Secret retreat suited them both quite well. "Let's look at another map of some place you might go to," Alice asked each evening by the firelight. She knew something had chased Rosellas out of his home and would soon chase him across these maps, but she wasn't curious about it. Could be anything. The election, probably, Alice thought. She knew New England landed gentry. It's one thing her mother taught her that stuck. Questions were unwelcome. Don't ask too many, or you'll end up disowned. Marinate generations of that in the 1860 presidential election. Of course, it's no surprise Alice would run into someone in a tent alone in the woods who made the supreme error of, well, anything. Alice could tell that's where Rosellas was. Someone said something, and next thing Rosellas knew, he was in a tent. His every bridge burned behind him, family relationships in shambles. She was his escape, and Alice wouldn't ruin that. One thing did make her curious, though. Button. She knew her cat. At one of her mother's oh-so-vital meetings with a group of Door Rebellion veterans, the host lady's cat had just born a litter, one of whom noticed Alice in a corner, sad and withdrawn, paying no attention to anything. So the kitten gave Alice something to pay attention to, and that was Button. The host lady, of course, gave Alice her new kitten, and from that day on, Button could tell when somebody was sad and was thus someone who would cuddle. Most people would tire of this game with Button, figuring out Button was in it entirely for himself, eventually shooing the cat away. But not Rosellas. Rosellas often held Button in a kind of trance. Bobbing back and forth, Rosellas hugged and squeezed Button constantly, who never got enough of it. Rosellas would pick up Button, then become so emotional, so distant, Alice couldn't help but want to comfort him. One day, after a terrible summer storm and the soft rain that followed, Rosellas rocked Button to sleep in his arms, almost seeming to weep over the cat, crouched like a child. Alice's heart broke, so finally, against all her instincts, she crossed into his soul. "Are you—" she began, struggling, terrified. "Are you all right?" Rosellas froze. Button felt it and woke up, tenderly pawing at his arm. In an instant, Rosellas realized he'd lost himself to being 8 years old again, so immediately returned to being 19. "Oh, Button, why'd you fall asleep on me?" Rosellas joked, tossing Button off his lap playfully. "He's entirely mercenary about being cuddled," Alice joked. Rosellas sighed, then he smiled at Alice. "Guess I'm just a sitting duck." Their eyes met. Alice thought, then nearly asked for the whole story, even taking a deep breath to launch into what surely would be a conversation late into the night. She was just about to venture into that unknown when Rosellas got up to dust himself off. "Guess I'll start tonight's campfire," he said, letting Alice off the hook. Relieved, she retreated behind the chasm that kept them from putting two and two together. The entire evening she waited for Rosellas to say something, anything. Surely if he wanted to talk about things, he would, but he didn't, so Alice wouldn't. She couldn't sleep that night. She stared at the tent above her as Rosellas snored a whiskey dream, mumbling into the pillow. Alice tried to understand his mumbles, making out only how sorry Rosellas was about something. It gave Alice chills. One afternoon near the end of their month together, they went fishing in a nearby stream, summer's full splendor shining down, shimmering off the water. Button chasing dragonflies here and there, Rosellis casting his line in and out, Alice lounging in the shade of a tree with one of Rosellis's book of maps as evening approached. Fish don't bite in the afternoon, really, Rosellis said, a couple hours of futility into it. I'll be going back home soon, Alice announced, paging through the map book. Rosellis put his fishing pole down to sit with her under the tree. Come west with me, Rosellis asked. Alice fidgeted, then looked into his eyes. Something was there in his eyes and in hers. She knew from the mountain range of maps forming the walls of his summer tent that Rosellis had thought about leaving Rhode Island since a child, and she knew that whatever attached Rosellis so desperately to Button must have something to do with finally deciding to go west, to flee. Just then Button crawled between them to cuddle on Rosellis. Onward came this pudgy little cat, pressing his paws at someone who seemed sad. No chasm of silence between Alice and his new friend, no teeth marks from his father's face still on Rosellis's knuckles were any match for Button's sense that someone needed to be cuddled, thus would cuddle him. The 1860 presidential election's oppressive weight on all thoughts and utterances meant nothing to Button. The more Rosellis pushed the cat away, the more cuddly Button became. Alice was captivated by this game of Rosellis pushing his childhood away and Button pushing it back onto him. With each push away, Rosellis tried to tell Button he was a man now, not a boy anymore. You have to go. Button kept coming, Rosellis dragging him off one loving scratch behind Button's neck at a time. Alice again wondered what it was inside Rosellis that her cat knew was there, but she didn't. We can take Button with us, Rosellis suggested, deciding finally he would tell Alice the whole story on the way west. About Widow Tucker, about asking his father about cotton mills once, only to be told to stop asking questions, about the pies his mother made for Widow Tucker that he'd deliver at Christmas time, that his father put an end to, about how good it felt to flatten his father with one punch for keeping him away from an old woman who needed company, keeping her alone and his son ignorant. Button pawed at him one last time, and Rosellis finally picked up Button, gave him a good squeeze, and repeated, We can surely take Button with us. Smiling at Alice. Oh, we hardly know each other, Alice protested half-heartedly. We'll get to know each other on the train or the stagecoach or the steamboat. It'll be fun, Rosellis insisted, holding Button up above him playfully. I think Button would enjoy the trip. Let's don't talk about such things now, Alice declared, standing up, grabbing Button from Rosellis with a flourish. You and this cat. Their last few nights together that summer hovered between worlds, hers, his, and reality, all of them kept at bay, always somehow. The morning Alice went back to her aunt's, no longer to return. Rosellis stood with his hands in his pockets, sending her off like she'd merely delivered a package. He'd decided. It didn't matter if Alice came along. He was going west. Promise you'll stop at the tavern before you leave, Alice asked. I promise, Rosellis answered, petting Button in Alice's arms. It'll be your last chance to join me, you know, he winked. 2 months later, Rosellis booked a stagecoach to the nearest train station westward, which would pick him up at the Waterman Tavern. So we're going to break one last time here before we finish Chapter 2 with a visit to the Waterman Tavern by the Wide Awakes. Now, you may have heard about the Wide Awakes in the last election. The Wide Awakes were Lincoln's sort of youth corps who would run around towns in their gowns and their capes and their torches. And as we see in this episode of the Wide Awakes in 1860 in Smithfield, Rhode Island, they're more woke than wide awake. And any quick research on the Wide Awake shows that they were for Lincoln, but not necessarily for abolition of slavery. So let's get into that. Haversack on his back, a bag in his hand, Rosellis made the turn on foot into Main Street in Greenville on a chilly gray autumn afternoon to see an election crowd outside the tavern. Being October, the 1860 presidential election campaign could be avoided no longer. Rosellis would leave Rhode Island behind in one country that would collapse into two before his journey ended. So seeing Smithfield's Wide Awakes chapter and a political confrontation at the doorway of the Waterman Tavern because of a cotton mill owner inside felt about right. Of course, Rosellis laughed to himself, pausing to watch Alice's father negotiate the delicate situation at the door of the tavern under the overcast sky. The Wide Awakes were Lincoln's youngest campaign arm, mostly male 18-year-olds organized into a spooky caped marching force that campaigned for the Republican ticket. Like the Pioneer Guards in Minnesota, the boys did it mostly for the ladies, who were specifically permitted membership for obvious reasons. The Wide Awakes would go out as evening fell, en masse, in capes with lanterns, dozens of, often hundreds at a time, campaigning for Lincoln for president in the same sort of paramilitary style as the Pioneer Guard went after Native American scares in the St. Paul on the frontier, except with torches and capes. Many Wide Awakes would die as Union soldiers in the war to come. To Southern Democrats and anyone up north who supported the expansion of slavery westward, thus opposed Lincoln's election, the Wide Awakes represented their deepest fear, a marching horde ready to take their slaves as if John Brown's hanging summoned them to life. A Wide Awakes rally often provoked a rage-filled counter-rally, especially in the western states of Indiana, Ohio, or Illinois, sometimes leading to a flat-out riot. They were not much liked outside of New England, where Lincoln would win every state handily, including Rhode Island, with 2/3 of the 1860 votes statewide. In Smithfield, the Wide Awakes faced little trouble, except from the odd cotton mill owner who knew what was what in 1860, knew the score, knew what the Wide Awakes' mere existence meant for his cotton mill, so would make a scene at a tavern. Today, it was the Waterman Tavern's turn. Starting a fire in the hearth of the tavern to keep the evening's autumn crowd warm, Alice saw two boys in capes enter the Waterman to begin gathering for their evening's march, then rushed to her father behind the bar, who was serving a cotton mill owner a whiskey. Her mother back home, lost in the outsider world of meetings and whatnot Alice was quite finished with. As a teenager, Alice attached herself to Pa and his strange job as a part tavern keeper, part bank headquarters clerk. Pa's most precarious hours each day at the Waterman were the overlap between when the bank closed for business and the tavern filled up. Board members or bank customers, like the cotton mill owner, always lingered for a drink or two. During the 1860 presidential election, Pa's duties in this regard expanded exponentially. Pa, Alice whispered, nodding to the entering campaigners. Pa looked. The cotton mill owner followed Pa's turning head and looked too. The next thing Alice knew, she was alone in the empty tavern for a half hour, everyone outside arguing. The liquor-loosened cotton mill owner speechified between the growing crowd of Wide Awakes and the tavern door. Pa just stood there, waiting for all the steam to release. Patience was Pa's best friend these days. Just let everyone let it all out. "Do you know anything about what keeps this state alive, this country?" shouted the cotton mill owner at the growing collection of Wide Awakes outside the tavern. "Lincoln will save the Union as it is," shouted one of the boys in a cape. "You will keep your cheap slave-produced cotton, old man." And so it went, as Marcellus arrived with his bag to keep his promise to Alice. Marcellus immediately knew who in the fracas was Alice's father, the man pacing quietly until the cotton mill owner ran out of energy and left, waving his arms, shouting into the cold autumn air. Pa escorted the Wide Awakes in, welcoming them as any tavern keeper would, Marcellus bringing up the rear of the crowd, passing Pa at the door. "Whose idea was it to put a bank in a tavern?" Marcellus asked Pa at the door. "One of the mysteries of the universe, young man," Pa said to Marcellus, ushering him in. Marcellus rushed to Alice at the bar, who greeted him with such a smile it seemed like summer again in the wilderness. "I see you've met Pa," Alice delighted, pouring Marcellus a whiskey. "My timing appears perfect," and Marcellus announced, sitting on a bar stool. "Are you coming with me?" Alice rolled her eyes. "Sorry it's been so long," Marcellus said. "I figured you'd already gone," Alice replied. "My mother insisted I make peace with my father before I left, which took 2 months," Marcellus explained, downing the whiskey. It was the first time Marcellus mentioned that which put him into his tent exile where they met. Alice paused her polishing of the bar, wondering again whether to pry or not, letting Marcellus breathe. "I think it's all better now," he said, looking around the tavern. "But it's good that I leave." Whatever put Marcellus into that tent that summer haunted Alice day and night for weeks. She found herself talking to Button, asking her cat what he knew about Marcellus that she didn't. But then an unnamed inertia set in, fueled by itself, her summertime with Marcellus fading into memory with the green of the leaves and the browns and the oranges and yellows and reds of New England autumn. She was just happy that Marcellus could speak of it at all without being asked, and had resolved it. Since it was over for him, it was over for her too. "So," Alice began with a new happy curiosity, "which map of yours is guiding you to where?" "It's a bit complicated," Marcellus began to explain. Map study for half his life long ago laid out his many route options. He would get a train across New York as far as Buffalo, where the first fork appeared in his road. In Buffalo, option 1, a schooner sailed him across Lake Erie, stopping in Cleveland to Detroit. There, another choice, either by schooner across the Great Lakes deep into Minnesota, or overland from there to Chicago, then to the Mississippi River, probably to Prairie du Chien, then in Wisconsin. There, another fork in the road, steamboat the Mississippi north to the end of the steamboat line in St. Paul, Minnesota, or south to St. Louis, where yet another fork in the road would force another decision. Buffalo, option 2, was to continue from there overland by train or coach, maybe down the Ohio River to Cincinnati, from there riding the winds of rail, steamboat, and stagecoach timetables. I figure by Buffalo I'll know more, Rosellas announced. Maybe I'll run out of money and get stuck there, but the plan is to keep heading west until this election is over, then see where I am. And you're leaving me here in, Alice waved demonstratively at the growing gathering of wideawakes. Here in all this. A couple of the wideawakes had lit their lantern torches in the bar. Pa went back outside to make sure no further trouble bubbled over. I cannot wait for this election to be over. Still time to join me, Rosellas tried again. Where's Button? Alice pointed to Button lounging on a box on the floor wrapped in brown paper and string near the door leading to the bank. There's Button. Rosellas walked over to Button and picked him up off the box to say hello. Button curled into his arms like an old friend, pawing at Rosellas as if to tell him something. Rosellas felt his boyhood again briefly, then placed Button back down onto the very old-looking box tied with string. Button rolled over onto his back, begging to be scratched, which Rosellas did, then returned to the bar. Is that box Button's bed? Rosellas asked Alice. Oh, just something someone left here to put in the bank for safekeeping. Pa has to take it into the vault. Come with me, Rosellas asked again. He leaned across the bar, trying his best puppy-eyed stare, Alice resisting, busying herself with barkeeping. Just get on that coach with me when it arrives, he persisted. Bring Button, too. Button rolled around on the very old, dusty box. Pa came back inside the tavern with news. Someone waiting for a westbound coach? That's me, Rosellas announced, bounding off the stool, collecting his things to go. Wait, Alice shouted, chasing after him from behind the bar and out the door, racing past Pa, who went to the old box tied with string, picked it up, and took it to the bank vault. She caught up to Rosellas in the courtyard of the tavern, pulling his arm. Why'd you leave so little time? She asked. He spun, wrapping his arm around her waist, yanking her toward him into embrace. Because I was afraid too much of this would convince me to stay. Then he kissed her like time did not exist, maple leaves drifting down around them in reds and yellows. The stagecoach driver rolled his eyes, used to such farewells, patiently waiting. Button had wandered out of the tavern following them, pressing into their legs between them. As their lips separated, Rosellas noticed Button at their feet, picked him up, put Button between their breasts, and they hugged together. Button curled up in his own little heaven between two lovers. You'll send me your address wherever you end up, won't you? Alice asked. As soon as I know where that is, Rosellas smiled. He gave her one last kiss on the forehead, tossed his bag into the coach, and the coach clip-clopped off into the autumn evening. Alice waved goodbye as Button followed the coach, stopping in the middle of the street, his tail curling this way and that, sitting down at attention to watch the coach disappear as if saluting. Thus ends Chapter 2 of Ghosts of Plum Run, Volume 2, Serpents and Dust, with a love scene for MGK to really soar in with his co-star who plays Alice in the Netflix series, wherever that is. Thank you again. Join us again next week for the Ghosts of Plum Run Hour, only on Midwestern Marks. We'll be doing Chapter 3 in Volume 2. Serpents and Dust. Volume 1 and 2 are available on Amazon. And thank you for joining us on Midwestern Marks. We'll talk to you next time. See you then.